The shout cracked through the marble lobby so hard it made people flinch before they even understood the words. "Get that out of my way. Now!" The voice belonged to a man who never waited for explanations. Richard Hall stood rigid near the security turnstile's coat, still on, phone clenched in his fist, jaw tight with a fury that had been simmering since before sunrise. The lobby of Hallstone Financial was quiet in that uneasy way that came when everyone sensed something was about to break. Shoes stopped mid-step. Conversations collapsed into whispers. Even the security desk went still. The janitor froze. Evan Carter had been guiding a yellow floor sign into place. Careful, slow the way he always moved when executives passed through. He was tall, late 40s, broad shoulders, softened by years of keeping his head down. His uniform was clean, but worn thin at the cuffs. When Richard lunged forward, Evan shifted the cart an inch too late. The wheel scraped the polished stone, a sound sharp enough to feel like a mistake you could not take back. Richard turned. For a second, the only sound was the low hum of the building's climate system. Then Richard stepped closer, invading the space Evan instinctively tried to shrink. "You think this is acceptable?" Richard said, his voice low now, controlled, somehow more dangerous. "You think my time is worth dodging mop buckets?" Evan opened his mouth, closed it. His breath moved in and out slowly, like he was counting without numbers. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. His voice was steady, almost too steady. "I was assigned this area." Richard laughed once. It wasn't loud. It wasn't amused. It landed wrong. "Assigned," he repeated. He looked around the lobby, as if inviting witnesses. "That's the problem. People like you wait to be assigned. People like me decide." A few feet away, Emily Hall watched the scene unfold with a tightening in her chest she didn't name. She had arrived early for a board call, coffee untouched in her hand. She recognized that look on her father's face. The look that came when something else had gone wrong and found a convenient target. She took a step forward. "Dad," she said quietly. Richard didn't hear her. Or chose not to. He tilted his head, eyes scanning Evan from boots to shoulders, lingering just long enough to strip him down to a roll. "How long have you been here?" Richard asked. "Almost 3 years," Evan said. And in all that time, Richard said, his tone sharpening. "No one taught you when to move out of the way." Emily stepped closer. "Dad, he didn't do anything." Richard finally looked at her. For half a second, something like restraint flickered. Then it vanished. "This is my building," he said. "Staff. If I let this slide, what message does that send?" Evan lowered his eyes, not in submission, but in calculation. He adjusted his grip on the cart. The skin at his temple tightened. "I'll clear the area," he said. "It won't happen again." That should have been the end of it. It never was with Richard Hall. "You don't get to decide what happens again," Richard snapped. "You don't get to decide anything. You clean. That's it." A security guard shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the elevators turned away. Emily felt heat rise to her face. "Dad, stop," she said, louder now. Richard waved a hand without looking. "Go upstairs, Emily." Evan moved to pull the cart back. As he did, his sleeve rode up just enough. A flash of ink, old and faded, peeked out against his forearm before he tugged the fabric down again. Emily's eyes caught it without knowing why. A shape, lines, something deliberate. It stirred a memory she couldn't place, like a word on the tip of her tongue. Richard missed it entirely. "I don't want to see him in this lobby again," Richard said to the security desk. "We'll talk to facilities." That was the line. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Evan nodded once. "Understood," he said. No anger, no pleading. He turned the cart with care and walked toward the service corridor, his footsteps even unhurried. The doors closed behind him with a soft, mechanical sigh. The lobby exhaled. Emily stared at the corridor longer than necessary. Her coffee had gone cold in her hand. Something about the way Evan had stood there, about the way he hadn't rushed, hadn't apologized beyond the first words, bothered her. People didn't react like that unless they were used to pressure. Real pressure. Upstairs, the building returned to its rhythm, but the story traveled faster than elevators. By mid-morning, it had grown teeth. In break rooms and behind cubicle walls, people leaned in close. He didn't even flinch. Did you see his eyes? Like he'd heard worse. Who talks to the boss like that without shaking? Frank Delaney heard the whispers from behind the glass of the security office. He had been watching the lobby feed when it happened. Fingers, steepled expression, unreadable. 59 years old, grey at the temples. A man who noticed details because he'd learned what happened when you didn't. He rewound the footage, watched again. Slower. The scrape of the wheel. The distance Evan kept. The way his shoulders squared without aggression. Frank paused the frame when the sleeve slipped. Zoomed in. The image blurred, sharpened, blurred again. He leaned closer. "That's strange," Frank muttered. He didn't say why. Not yet. 2 floors up, Richard Hall closed his office door harder than necessary. His assistant hovered, unsure whether to speak. Richard stared out at the city, at the grey stretch of Chicago steel and glass chest, tight with a frustration that hadn't eased. He replayed the moment in his head, already convinced of his own righteousness. Order mattered. Control mattered. You couldn't let the building run you. Still an image lingered. The janitor's face. Calm. Measuring. As if he'd been watching Richard instead. In the facilities corridor, Evan set the cart against the wall and rested his hands on the handle. He breathed in through his nose, slow, out through his mouth. The hum of machinery vibrated through the floor. He reached up, tugged his sleeve down farther than necessary, covering the ink beneath. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved. Somewhere above him, phones buzzed. Emails moved. Decisions stacked on top of decisions. None of them yet connected the quiet man in the service hallway to the weight he carried, or to the past that refused to stay buried for long. Not yet. But the building had shifted. Everyone felt it. And before the day was over, the cost of that moment in the lobby would begin to surface not as noise, but as truth sharp and unavoidable. Frank Delaney did not believe in coincidences, not after 4 decades of watching ordinary days collapse, because someone ignored a small detail. He rewound the footage again, this time with the sound-off eyes fixed on the janitor's posture as the CEO loomed inches away. Evan Carter never leaned back, never flinched. His shoulders stayed level, his feet planted, as if the floor itself mattered. Frank had seen that stance before, not in office buildings, not in men paid to disappear into the background. He enlarged the frame until the pixels fought him, until the sleeve slipped just enough to show the ink. A blade. Wings. Numbers arranged with intention. Frank felt the familiar tightening at the base of his skull, the quiet alertness that never fully left him after service. He printed the still and slid it into a thin folder unmarked. Across the building, Emily Hall sat in a conference room she had booked and then forgotten to use. Her laptop was open to a blank screen. The image of that tattoo would not leave her. She searched her memory, the way she used to search archives late at night, chasing a half-remembered reference. Years earlier, she had volunteered on a media campaign for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. There had been briefings, sensitivity guidelines, a single slide that stuck because it wasn't meant to be shared, symbols that were never explained, only labeled restricted. She rubbed her temple and closed the laptop. She told herself she was reading too much into it. Then she stood, grabbed her coat, and walked toward security. Evan worked the lower levels that afternoon. Concrete corridors, mechanical rooms, the places where the building showed its bones. He moved with purpose, not rushing, not dragging time. A younger maintenance tech glanced at him and looked away. Evan noticed everything. He always did. He checked his watch, an old analog piece with a scratched face, and adjusted his route by instinct. When a supervisor passed, Evan nodded once, neutral. No one stopped him. That was the point. Frank met Emily near the security office door. She spoke first. "I saw something this morning," she said. Her voice was careful. "On one of the cameras." Frank studied her for a beat. He liked Emily. She listened. "So did I," he said. He opened the folder enough for her to glimpse the image, the tattoo frozen in grainy black and white. Emily's breath caught before she could hide it. "That's real," she said. "It's not just decoration." Frank nodded. "I don't jump to conclusions," he said. "But I don't ignore patterns either." Emily swallowed. "My father crossed a line." Frank did not correct her. "I'm going to verify," he said, quietly. Verification took time. Frank made calls that never left voicemails. He waited for returned calls that came late and ended early. He spoke in fragments, names without context, dates without explanations. The answers came slower than he liked, and that worried him more than silence. Meanwhile, the building prepared for a different kind of pressure. An oversight visit scheduled months ago moved up without explanation. 2 agencies, joint review, compliance and risk. Richard Hall welcomed the news. He liked scrutiny when he believed he controlled it. Richard paced his office as assistants fed him updates. The janitor incident was already fading in his mind, replaced by the arithmetic of influence and deadlines. He rehearsed talking points. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, the practiced confidence settling back into place. When Emily entered without knocking, he barely looked at her. "We need to talk," she said. "Later," Richard said. "I have visitors. This is about this morning." Richard sighed. "Emily, don't. You humiliated someone," she said. And I think you underestimated who. Richard stopped pacing. He turned slowly. This again, he said. You're letting your conscience get theatrical. Emily held his gaze. You don't know what you did. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. We'll discuss it tonight, he said. After this is over. Nothing was ever over at Hallstone. It simply changed shape. By mid-afternoon, Frank had enough to be uneasy. Not enough to accuse, enough to prepare. He watched Evan from a distance as the janitor moved through a restricted hallway without setting off any alarms. Frank noticed how Evan adjusted his pace when a camera angle shifted how he chose routes that avoided crowds without avoiding visibility. The man did not hide. He navigated. Frank's phone vibrated, a number he had not seen in years. He stepped into the stairwell before answering. The voice on the other end was older, thinner, but unmistakable. They spoke in shorthand words, weighted with memory. When the call ended, Frank leaned against the concrete wall and closed his eyes for a count he did not measure. In the executive wing, the oversight team arrived with polite smiles and hard eyes. Suits, briefcases, questions wrapped in courtesy. Richard played his role flawlessly, guiding them through presentations and corridors, narrating success like a sermon. The team nodded, took notes, asked about protocols. One of them paused near a security camera feed and tilted his head. "Who's that?" he asked. Richard followed the gaze. The screen showed Evan crossing the lobby, at a distance pushing an empty cart. Richard's jaw tightened. "Facilities," he said. "Temporary assignment." The man nodded slowly. "Interesting," he said, without elaboration. Emily watched from the edge of the room. Her pulse quickened. She caught Frank's eye through the glass. He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not yet." Evan felt the building change before anyone said a word. The air shifted. Movement tightened. He adjusted his route again. Hands steady. Breathing even. When his radio crackled with a routine call, he answered calmly. "Copy," he said. He passed a reflective surface and caught his own eyes. They were clear, focused. He pulled his sleeve down and kept walking. The oversight meeting stretched longer than planned. Questions deepened. Richard's patience thinned. When the final handshake came, it did not bring relief. One of the visitors lingered by the door. "We'll be in touch," he said. "Sooner than later." As the door closed, Richard exhaled hard. "What was that about?" he snapped. Emily stepped forward. "It's connected," she said. "All of it." Richard laughed sharply. "You're seeing ghosts." Frank entered, then unannounced. He stood straight, hands at his sides. "Sir," he said. "We need a private word." Richard bristled. "Now is not the time." Frank did not move. "It is." Silence pressed in. Richard waved a hand toward the inner office. "Fine," he said. The door shut. Frank placed the folder on the desk and slid it forward. Richard glanced at the image and scoffed. "A tattoo," he said. "So what?" Frank met his eyes. "It's not decoration," he said. "And the man wearing it is not who you think." Richard leaned back, irritation sharpening into something else. "You're telling me a janitor is a threat?" Frank chose his words carefully. I'm telling you that underestimating him is a mistake. Richard opened his mouth to retort. Then his phone rang. He checked the caller. Unknown. He hesitated, then answered. His expression changed as he listened. The color drained from his face, replaced by disbelief, edged with fear. Frank watched without comment. In the service corridor below, as Evan paused at the elevator, he did not press the button right away. He listened. The building spoke to him in vibrations and echoes. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and finally allowed himself a single breath that carried the weight of years. The reveal was coming. Not as spectacle, not as noise, as consequence. The phone slipped from Richard Hall's hand and hit the desk without a sound, like the building itself had swallowed the impact. He stared at the screen as if it might change its mind. It didn't. Frank Delaney watched him carefully, noting the way Richard's breathing shortened, the way his shoulders stiffened as control began to fracture. "Who was that?" Emily asked, stepping closer. Richard did not answer right away. His mouth opened closed. He cleared his throat. "Someone who shouldn't know my name," he said finally. "Someone who just used it." Frank spoke before Emily could. "They asked about the janitor," he said. It wasn't a question. Richard's eyes snapped up. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Frank said. "That I was still verifying." Richard pushed back from the desk and stood pacing the length of the office. "This is absurd," he said. "I run a financial firm, not a museum of ghosts." Emily's voice cut through him, steady and sharp. "Dad, stop pretending this is nothing. You humiliated a man in front of half the building. And now agencies are calling you directly." Richard turned on her. "You think this is my fault?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. The word landed harder than any accusation. In the security office, monitors flickered with routine feeds. Frank had left the door open on purpose. He wanted visibility. He wanted witnesses. Evan Carter's image appeared briefly on one screen, stepping out of an elevator near the executive floor, pushing an empty cart. He wasn't supposed to be there, not according to the updated schedule. Frank felt a surge of tension that was not fear, but anticipation. Evan moved through the corridor like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He passed offices with glass walls, their occupants too busy to look up. He stopped outside a conference room where a few assistants hovered whispering. One of them looked at him, opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. Evan met her eyes for a fraction of a second. She stepped aside without understanding why. Inside the conference room, the oversight team had returned unannounced. Papers were spread across the table. The man who had lingered earlier stood with his jacket off. Sleeves rolled the picture of polite authority. Richard entered with forced composure. Emily followed. Frank took a position near the door. "We didn't expect you back so soon," Richard said. "Schedules change," the man replied. "So do assessments." He nodded toward the door, just as Evan pushed the cart inside. The room went still. Conversations stopped mid-word. Evan placed the cart near the wall and began wiping a spotless section of floor with slow, deliberate movements. Richard's face flushed. "What is he doing here?" he demanded. The man smiled faintly. "Working," he said. "Same as all of us." Emily's heart pounded. She watched Evan's hands. Steady. Unrushed. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at anyone. The man across the table leaned back. Mr. Hall, he said we received a query from an external review board regarding an individual employed in your building. Richard laughed, sharp and brittle. A janitor. The man's gaze did not waver. A former federal asset, he said, with a service record that intersects with multiple oversight jurisdictions. The word asset echoed in the room. Evan stopped moving. He straightened slowly, resting both hands on the mop handle. He lifted his head. When he looked at Richard, there was no anger there, only recognition. Frank felt the air tighten. He stepped forward. "Evan," he said quietly. Evan nodded once. He rolled his sleeve up, not in defiance, but in clarity. The tattoo was fully visible now. Old lines, faded ink, a symbol that carried weight without explanation. One of the oversight officers rose from his chair. He stared at the ink, then at Evan's face. "I knew I recognized you," he said softly. "You were listed as inactive." "I retired," Evan said. His voice was calm, measured. That was the term they used. Richard took a step back as if the floor had shifted. "This is a joke," he said. "Some kind of stunt." Emily turned on him. "Stop," she said. "Just stop." The officer folded his hands. "Mr. Hall, he said this individual was involved in operations that prevented losses you cannot quantify. Financial, human, institutional. He is not required to disclose his past to you. You are required to treat him as a citizen." Silence pressed in heavy and unforgiving. Richard swallowed. "Why is he here?" he asked the question, stripped of arrogance. Evan answered before anyone else. "Because I needed work," he said. "Because this building was quiet. Because no one asked questions." Emily's eyes filled. "You let him clean our floors," she whispered. Evan looked at her then. "I chose it," he said. "There's a difference." The oversight officer slid a folder across the table toward Richard. "We are initiating a review of your leadership practices," he said. "Effective immediately." Richard stared at the folder as if it might burn him. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "What happens now?" Frank answered. "You step back," he said. "You listen. You learn." Richard's shoulders sagged. In that moment, he looked older than his years, smaller than the office he occupied. He turned to Evan. "I didn't know," he said. Evan studied him. "You didn't want to," he replied. The words were not cruel. They were precise. The oversight team gathered their materials and left without ceremony. The room emptied slowly, assistants whispering, eyes wide. Frank lingered, then nodded at Evan. "Thank you," he said. Evan inclined his head. "You did your job," he said. Emily waited until they were alone. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it." Evan met her gaze. "You noticed," he said. "That matters." Richard stood by the window looking out at the city. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I built this place," he said. "I thought that meant something." "It does," Evan said. "It means you're responsible for what happens inside it." Evan pulled his sleeve back down and reached for the cart. He did not linger. As he left the room, the weight shifted with him, like a storm moving on. In the corridor, Evan paused once, resting his hand against the cool glass. He allowed himself a single moment of stillness. Then he walked on, leaving behind a silence that would not fade quickly. Upstairs, Richard Hall sat alone in his office. The city stretched beneath him, and for the first time in decades, he understood how small power could be when stripped of respect. Rain had started without ceremony, the kind that slicked the sidewalks and muted the city into a low, constant hush. Evan Carter stepped out through the service exit and let the doors close behind him. The building did not follow. It loomed glass and steel, reflecting a man it had failed to see until it had no choice. He adjusted his collar, felt the familiar weight settle back into his shoulders, and walked toward the parking structure without hurry. Inside, Hallstone Financial did not breathe easy. It breathed carefully. Richard Hall stood at the window of his office, watching the rain trace thin paths down the glass. The folder lay open on his desk, its contents unread because he already knew what they said. Oversight, temporary reassignment, independent review. Words that stripped paint off power and left the wood bare. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt nothing. Not cold, not heat, just the absence of certainty. Emily knocked once and entered without waiting. She closed the door behind her. The room smelled faintly of coffee and ozone from the storm. "They're calling for a statement," she said. "Media is sniffing around. Quietly, but they are." Richard didn't turn. "Let them sniff," he said. His voice lacked force. "I've earned scrutiny." Emily crossed the room and stood beside the desk. "You earned consequences," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded once. "I didn't see him," he said. "I saw what I wanted to see." Downstairs, Frank Delaney sat alone in the security office. The monitors dimmed to a respectful glow. He had sent his report. He had closed the loop. He allowed himself a breath he'd been holding since morning. The building would change now. Not because a man with ink under his sleeve had walked through it, but because the lie had been punctured. Frank reached for his coat. He had one more thing to do. Evan's truck waited in the lower level, its paint dulled by years and weather. He tossed his gloves onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The radio crackled to life with talk he did not listen to. He pulled into traffic and let the city take him. The rain eased as he crossed the river, the water below reflecting the last of the afternoon light in broken lines. His phone vibrated once. He glanced at it and did not answer. Not yet. He turned onto a quieter street and parked. He sat with the engine running, watching pedestrians hurry past with collars turned up, shoulders hunched against the weather. Ordinary lives, precious in their ordinariness. He shut off the engine and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, counting breaths without numbers. At the building, the board convened in a room that smelled of old wood and newer fear. Chairs scraped, papers rustled, words like governance and culture floated above the table. Richard took his seat and did not speak. When he did later, his voice surprised them all. It was quieter, measured. He did not defend himself. He did not explain away the moment in the lobby. He said he had failed. He said the failure had been public. He said the remedy would be too. Emily watched faces change as he spoke. Not softened, sharpened. Respect returned not because he held power, but because he surrendered posture. When the meeting ended, she lingered. One of the directors leaned toward her and whispered, "You did the right thing?" Emily nodded, unsure whether that would ever feel like enough. Frank drove to a modest house on the west side, a place with a porch light that flickered when the rain hit it just right. He rang the bell. Evan opened the door. Surprised, then unsurprised, they stood there a moment. Two men who recognized each other without ceremony. "I wanted to say it in person," Frank said. "I'm sorry it took so long." Evan stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They sat at a small table with chipped paint and strong coffee. Frank spoke of the calls he had made, the questions he had asked. Evan listened, nodding once in a while. When Frank finished, Evan smiled faintly. "You did what you could," he said. "That matters." Frank hesitated. "What happens now?" Evan looked out the window at the rain-softened street. "I finish what I started," he said. "I keep my head down until I don't need to anymore." Frank left after a handshake that meant more than it looked like. Evan washed the mugs and set them upside down to dry. His phone buzzed again. He answered this time. Emily's voice was careful. "I hope this isn't intrusive." "It's fine," Evan said. "I wanted you to know she said my father will issue a public apology. Not a statement. An apology. He'll step back. We're setting up an independent review. And a fund." Evan closed his eyes briefly. "Do it for the right reasons," he said. "Not for me." "I know," Emily said. Her voice wavered. "Thank you for not making this worse." Evan opened his eyes. "Truth has a way of doing what it needs to," he said, "whether we help it or not." When the call ended, Evan sat in the quiet and let the day settle. He thought of the lobby, the scrape of a wheel, the way anger had reached for him and found nothing to grab. He thought of the men and women who would never have to see that moment to feel its echo. He stood pulled on his jacket and stepped back into the rain. The next morning, the city woke to headlines that did not shout. They spoke plainly. A leader steps aside. A review begins. A building learns. Richard Hall stood at a podium later that day and said words that tasted like humility. He did not mention Lord Evan by name. He spoke of dignity, of blindness, of work to be done. Cameras clicked. The rain held. Evan watched none of it. He drove early to a place by the lake where the water met the sky without interruption. He walked the shoreline and felt the wind cut through his jacket clean and honest. When his phone vibrated again, he read the message and smiled once. He typed a reply and put the phone away. By evening, the storm had passed. The city dried itself and moved on, carrying the lesson whether it wanted to or not. In a building downtown, people spoke more softly to one another. In a small house, a man slept without dreaming. And somewhere between power and quiet, a truth had found its place not as spectacle, but as a line no one would cross again without remembering the sound it made when it finally broke. The first thing Evan Carter noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of pressure. No radios crackling. No elevators chiming with urgency. No eyes tracking him as he crossed a room. The morning air inside the small neighborhood grocery store felt ordinary, almost fragile in its normalcy. He picked up a basket, nodded at the cashier he recognized by routine rather than name, and moved down the aisle at the pace of someone who no longer needed to measure his steps. Outside, the city had already decided what the story was. Headlines had settled into opinion. Commentators framed it as leadership failure, cultural reckoning, overdue accountability. Some called it redemption. Others called it exposure. Evan ignored all of it. He paid in cash, carried the bag to his truck, and sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet hold. At Hallstone Financial, the quiet felt different. It pressed instead of released. Conversations lowered when footsteps approached. People looked up more often. Doors that once stayed open now closed halfway, not out of secrecy, but uncertainty. Richard Hall arrived early and walked the length of the lobby without escort. He noticed the floor for the first time. The reflection of the lights, the absence of a yellow sign where one used to stand. He stopped, then continued his shoes, echoing louder than he liked. Emily watched him from the mezzanine. He looked smaller from above. Not diminished, but altered like a man who had finally realized the room did not revolve around him. She followed him upstairs and waited until the office door closed. "You didn't have to come in today," she said. Richard loosened his tie and set it on the desk. "Yes," he said. "I did." He sat hands folded, posture uncharacteristically still. "I've spent decades thinking leadership meant certainty," he said. "That if I spoke loudly enough, clearly enough, the world would align." Emily said nothing. "I was wrong," he continued. "Certainty is easy when no one challenges you. Respect is harder." She leaned against the desk. "This isn't about one moment," she said. "It's about patterns." Richard nodded. "I know." He looked at the empty chair across from him. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Emily did not ask who. "No," she said gently. "And he shouldn't have to." Frank Delaney arrived mid-morning and found the security office rearranged, screens repositioned, chairs moved. A suggestion box sat on the counter, already holding a few folded slips. He read none of them. He took his seat and checked the feeds. Everything normal, which for the first time in a long while felt like progress. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he recognized without saving. "Take care of the place." Frank smiled faintly and typed back. Always did. Evan spent the afternoon in his garage, hands deep in an engine that had nothing to do with the past week. Grease under his nails, metal responding to pressure the way it was supposed to. He worked without hurry, letting muscle memory take over. The radio murmured in the background. When his phone rang again, he let it go to voicemail. When it rang a second time, he wiped his hands and answered. "This is Evan." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but measured. Introductions followed. An offer framed carefully. Consulting, short-term, discreet. The kind of work that lived between lines on paper. "I'm not interested," Evan said. There was a pause. "We understand you prefer privacy," the voice said. Evan looked at the open garage door at the street beyond. Kids rode past on bikes. A neighbor waved. "I prefer peace," he replied. "Those aren't the same thing." The call ended politely. Evan set the phone down and returned to the engine, the decision already made. That evening, Emily attended a small gathering she had not planned to go to. Former colleagues, community leaders, people who spoke earnestly about change. She listened more than she talked. When someone asked her how her father was holding up, she answered honestly. Learning, she said. Slowly. On her way out, a woman she barely knew touched her arm. "That man," the woman said quietly. "The one everyone's talking about. He reminded us who we forgot to see." Emily drove home with the windows down, the city lights blurring into something softer than before. Richard stayed late. He opened drawers he had not opened in years, found notes in his own handwriting that felt foreign now. He sat at his desk and wrote by hand, crossing out more than he kept. When he finished, he folded the page and placed it in an envelope without an address. He did not know if it would ever be sent. He knew it needed to be written. Evan cooked dinner as the sun went down. Simple food, familiar motions. He ate at the table and washed the plate immediately after. Later he sat on the porch and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. His phone buzzed with a final message of the day. No name. Just a sentence. "The fund is live." He exhaled and leaned back, eyes on the darkening sky. Days passed. The story aged. Something else took its place in the news cycle. Inside the building, policies changed. Training sessions replaced assumptions. Names were learned. Questions were asked before orders were given. It was not perfect. It was better. One morning, a new janitor paused in the lobby, unsure where to place a sign. A senior analyst stopped and held the door. "You're good there," he said. The janitor nodded, relieved. The moment passed unnoticed, by cameras unremarkable and complete. Miles away, Evan walked the lake path again, hands in his pockets, the wind sharp and clean. He stopped at the water's edge and watched the horizon until it settled his thoughts. He did not feel victorious. He felt finished, not with the world, but with a chapter he had not asked to reopen. When he turned back toward his truck, the city moved around him as it always had. Busy, imperfect, capable of learning when forced to listen. Evan drove home with the radio off the engine, steady beneath him, carrying forward a truth that did not need to be spoken aloud. Some lessons announce themselves, others arrive quietly, leave no mark on paper, and change everything all the same. The invitation arrived in the mail without a return address. Heavy paper folded once the ink pressed deep, as if the words themselves had weight. Evan Carter held it between his fingers for a long moment before opening it, already knowing what it would say, without reading a line. He set it on the kitchen table, poured coffee, and watched steam rise as the morning light crept across the floor. Outside, a delivery truck idled, then pulled away. The neighborhood woke itself gently unaware of the choice sitting inches from his hand. Across the city, Richard Hall woke earlier than he had in years. Not with urgency, but with an unease that came from listening too closely to his own thoughts. He dressed without assistance, choosing a jacket he hadn't worn since before success hardened into habit. In the mirror, he studied his reflection and did not look away. The lines were deeper now, honest. He nodded to himself once a private acknowledgement that today would not belong to him in the way days used to. Emily met him at the curb. She said nothing as he opened the car door. Nothing as they drove. When the building came into view, she spoke quietly. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," Richard said. "I do." The atrium had been rearranged. chairs set in clean rows. No banners, no stage lights. The sound system tested and retested until silence fell exactly where it should. People gathered without spectacle. Employees, board members, a few community partners, no press. Richard had insisted on that. If the words mattered, they would matter without an audience. Frank Delaney stood near the back, arms folded, eyes, scanning the room the way he always did. He felt a tension he did not dislike. The kind that meant something was about to be put right, or at least faced honestly. He checked his watch, and then the doors. He did not expect Evan to come. He hoped he would. Evan read the invitation once, then again, and folded it carefully. He placed it back in the envelope and slid it into his jacket pocket. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and locked the door behind him. The truck started on the first turn of the key. He drove without rushing, letting the city decide the pace. Traffic slowed him. A light caught him. He didn't mind. When he arrived, he parked 2 blocks away. He walked the rest hands in his pockets, the building rising ahead of him like a question he did not owe an answer. At the entrance, a security guard he did not recognize nodded. Evan nodded back and kept moving. Inside the room settled as if it sensed him before it saw him. Not a hush, a recalibration. Frank felt it and turned. Their eyes met. Frank's expression softened. Evan inclined his head and took a seat near the aisle, not the front. Richard stepped to the lectern. He did not clear his throat. He waited until the room gave him its attention, then began. His voice was steady, stripped of flourish. He spoke of responsibility without reciting policy, of harm without euphemism. He named the moment in the lobby without dramatizing it. He said the words he had avoided for decades. I was wrong. I failed. I judged a man by a uniform and my own impatience. Emily watched faces change as he spoke. Some tightened. Some eased. She felt a weight lift that she had not realized she carried. When Richard stepped back, he did not look relieved. He looked lighter. Frank moved to the lectern, briefly explaining the steps that would follow. Independent review, accountability measures, a fund not named, not branded. He spoke plainly. Then he stepped aside. There was a pause. It stretched. The room waited, without knowing for what. Evan stood. He did not walk to the front. He did not need to. He spoke from where he was, his voice carrying without effort. I didn't come for an apology, he said. And I didn't come to be seen. He let the words land. I came because what happens next matters more than what happened to me. Richard turned, eyes fixed on him. Breath held. Evan continued. Most people here will never wear a uniform that draws attention. That doesn't mean their work is invisible. It means it's essential. He glanced around the room, meeting eyes not lingering. Dignity isn't granted by position. It's practiced in moments when no one is watching. Silence deepened, not heavy but attentive. I don't want my name attached to anything, Evan said. I don't want a plaque. I don't want a story. He paused. I want you to notice the next person before you decide who they are. He sat. The room exhaled together a single breath. Applause rose, not loud, not prolonged. It stopped on its own. Richard stepped down from the lectern and crossed the floor. He stopped in front of Evan, not blocking, not looming. He held out his hand. Evan looked at it. Then he stood and shook it. Firm, brief, respectful. "Thank you," Richard said, and meant it in a way that did not ask for forgiveness. Evan nodded. "Take care of your people," he said. "That's the job." After people approached Evan in twos and threes, careful not to crowd him. He listened more than he spoke. He accepted gratitude and deflected praise with the ease of someone practiced in refusal. Emily waited until the room thinned. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "You changed the trajectory of this place." Evan shook his head. "It was already moving," he said. "It just needed friction." Outside, the afternoon light broke through clouds, turning glass into something warmer. Evan walked toward the exit, Frank falling into step beside him. "You all right, Frank?" asked. "I will be," Evan said. They stopped at the doors. Frank hesitated. "If you ever need—" "I know," Evan said and smiled. Evan stepped into the street and let the doors close behind him. The city met him as it always did, indifferent and alive. He walked to his truck, started the engine, and pulled into traffic. The radio stayed off. He did not look back. Inside the building, chairs were stacked, the room returning to its ordinary shape. People lingered in the lobby, speaking more softly than before. Richard stood by the window and watched Evan's truck disappear into the flow of cars. He did not wave. He did not need to. Later that evening, Evan returned home and placed the envelope on the table. He opened it once more, then tore it cleanly in half and dropped it into the recycling. He washed his hands, cooked dinner, and ate as the sun set. When darkness settled, he sat on the porch and listened to the night. The city hummed. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere else it opened. The chapter ended without ceremony, as most honest things do, leaving behind a line drawn quietly but unmistakably, one that would hold long after the ink of any invitation had faded. Morning arrived without drama, the kind that slipped through curtains and settled on furniture like it belonged there. Evan Carter woke before the alarm he no longer set, and lay still, listening to the house breathe. Pipes clicked. A bird tested a note outside the window and tried again. He swung his feet to the floor and felt the coolness ground him. Today would be ordinary if he let it be. Across town, Hallstone Financial opened its doors to a different rhythm. People arrived early, not to be seen, but to get things right. A facilities supervisor walked the lobby with a clipboard and stopped to greet the cleaning crew by name. A junior associate held the door for a courier and waited until the cart cleared the threshold. None of it felt forced. It felt careful, which was new. Richard Hall entered later than usual and did not head straight for the elevator. He stood near the security desk and watched the lobby for a long moment, hands loose at his sides. He noticed the small things now, the way light moved across the floor, the way voices softened when they passed one another. He did not miss the man who used to be there with a cart and a sign. He missed the chance he had wasted. The difference mattered. Emily arrived with a folder under her arm, and a purpose she no longer disguised as momentum. She had slept well for the first time in weeks. When she reached her office, she found a note on her desk in her father's handwriting. It was brief. It did not explain itself. It thanked her for standing still when he had not. She folded it and put it in her bag. Frank Delaney took a long route through the building, checking nothing in particular. He stopped by the break room and poured coffee for a maintenance worker whose hands shook slightly from the night shift. He listened when the man talked about his daughter's school play. He nodded at the right moments. When he left, he felt lighter than he had in years. Evan spent the morning fixing a fence for a neighbor who had not asked for help directly, but had mentioned the problem twice in passing. He measured twice cut once and set the post with care. The neighbor brought lemonade and asked no questions. Evan drank it and thanked him. When the fence stood straight, he stepped back and studied it like a promise kept. The phone rang while Evan washed his hands. He answered without looking at the screen. The voice was familiar now. "We're closing the review," Frank said. "It went the right way." "Good," Evan said. "There's a note for you," Frank added. "No pressure." Evan closed his eyes briefly. "Mail it," he said. "I'll read it when I'm ready." After the call, Evan sat at the table and waited for the feeling to arrive. It didn't. He stood and went back outside, letting the sun do its quiet work. At Halston, the board convened and adjourned without incident. A policy passed unanimously. Training scheduled. A fund allocated without a name attached. Richard listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to ask questions that made room for other answers. He felt the absence of certainty and did not rush to fill it. By afternoon, the city returned to its usual noise. Traffic thickened. Horns argued. Somewhere, a siren tested urgency. Evan drove to the lake and parked where the path curved away from crowds. He walked with his hands in his pockets, the wind tugging at his jacket. The water moved in steady lines, patient and indifferent. He stood and let the horizon settle his thoughts. He thought of the years he had spent measuring risk in other places, of the weight that had lifted when he chose quiet over control. He thought of the lobby and the scrape of a wheel. How small a sound could be. How large its echo. When he returned home, the mail waited. Bills, flyers, an envelope without a logo, the paper heavier than the rest. He set it aside and cooked dinner first, letting routine claim the space. After he opened the envelope and read the note, it was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It named harm without justification. It promised action without asking for absolution. Evan folded it and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a marker. Evening fell gently. On the street, a couple argued softly and then laughed. A dog barked and was shushed. Life kept its imperfect cadence. Evan stepped onto the porch and watched the sky dim. In the building downtown, Emily stayed late to finish a proposal that would redirect resources to places that rarely made headlines. She paused when she finished, aware of the quiet that followed good work. She sent the file and shut down her computer. On her way out, she passed the lobby and smiled at a cleaner who smiled back, surprised and pleased. Richard locked his office and stood for a moment, listening to the building after hours. He placed his hand against the wall, not in possession, but in recognition. He turned off the light and left without looking back. Frank ended his shift and drove home through streets that knew him well. He parked and sat in the car a moment longer than necessary, thinking of the line that had been drawn and the people who would keep it. He sent a final message and smiled when the reply came back. "Take care," it said. Always he typed. Night settled fully. Evan sat at the table with a cup of tea, and the drawer opened the folded note visible. He did not reread it. He did not need to. He closed the drawer and turned off the light. The city slept in patches. Somewhere, a lobby floor gleamed under lights that would not notice who polished them. Somewhere else, a fence stood straight. A lesson moved without announcing itself, carried by small acts repeated until they held. Evan lay down and let sleep come when it wanted. Tomorrow would be ordinary again. That was the point. The morning the city felt lighter. Evan Carter noticed it in the way traffic yielded without complaint, and in the way the sky opened cleanly over the rooftops, pale blue and undecided about warmth. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and stepped outside with no agenda beyond the shape of the day. The truck started easily. He drove toward the hardware store because a hinge had been sticking for weeks, and he finally felt like fixing it. Downtown Hallstone. Financial moved through its routines with a new restraint that did not feel like fear. It felt like attention. People paused before speaking. They waited an extra beat before deciding. The lobby lights reflected off stone that had learned to hold a different kind of quiet. A facilities supervisor walked the floor with a trainee and pointed out corners that mattered. The trainee listened and asked questions. No one rushed them. Richard Hall arrived early again. He did not go to his office. He stood near the windows and watched the city wake. He thought of the years he had measured mornings by urgency alone and felt the difference settle into his chest. It was not relief. It was responsibility without disguise. When Emily joined him, they stood together without speaking. "Board call at 9, she said eventually. "I'll be there," he said. "I want to hear it all." They walked upstairs side by side. In the conference room, the call began with updates that were precise and unadorned. Questions came from places that used to be silent. Richard listened. When he spoke, he asked for clarity and waited for it. He did not interrupt. When the call ended, he thanked everyone and stayed seated a moment longer. Hands folded, the habit of control loosening one fiber at a time. At the hardware store, Evan found the hinge he needed and a new set of gloves he didn't. He chatted with the clerk about nothing in particular. Outside, a man struggled with a stack of lumber. Evan stepped in without asking, took the weight and carried it to the truck. The man thanked him and moved on. No exchange lingered. That suited Evan fine. He drove home and replaced the hinge with care, aligning it until the door closed without complaint. He stood back and tested it twice, the click of metal clean and final. He felt the satisfaction settle and pass like a wave that knew when to leave. In the afternoon, Frank Delaney walked the perimeter of the building with a clipboard he did not need. He stopped to watch a courier load packages and offered a steadying hand. He checked the security feeds and noted nothing of interest. That, too, felt like progress. When his phone buzzed, he read the message and smiled before pocketing it. Emily spent the afternoon in meetings that mattered, not because they were large, but because they were specific. She asked how changes would be measured. She asked who would be accountable when attention drifted. She took notes and assigned follow-ups. When someone tried to shift responsibility upward, she brought it back down to where it lived. By the time she left the building, felt different again, as if it had learned a new posture. Evan drove to the lake in the late light and sat with the window down. The smell of water and cut grass threading the air. He watched a couple argue on the path and make up before passing out of sight. He watched a runner slow to a walk, and then to a stop, hands on knees, breath loud and alive. He watched the horizon do its quiet work. When his phone vibrated, he ignored it. When it vibrated again, he glanced and smiled before silencing it. He did not feel pulled. At Hallstone, a small group gathered in the lobby after hours. No announcement, no cameras. Just people who worked there standing in a loose circle. Richard stepped forward, not to speak, but to listen. A cleaner spoke about schedules that never fit. An analyst spoke about pressure that hid behind deadlines. A receptionist spoke about the way words landed. Richard nodded and took notes on a folded page. When he spoke, it was to ask what would help. The answers were not dramatic. They were practical. He wrote them down. Evan returned home at dusk and found a neighbor waiting by the fence he had fixed days earlier. She held a pie wrapped in foil and looked embarrassed to be holding it. Evan laughed softly and took it with both hands. They talked about the weather and about nothing else. When she left, he set the pie on the counter and washed his hands, again the habit of care grounding him. Night fell. The city lit itself carefully. Inside the building downtown, lights went out in stages, floors dimming one by one. Richard locked his office and stood for a moment in the dark, letting the hum of the building settle. He placed the folded page from the lobby circle into his pocket. He did not know when he would read it again. He knew he would. Frank drove home and parked, engine ticking as it cooled. He sat with the door open and listened to the neighborhood. He thought of the line that had been drawn quietly, and of the many small hands that would keep it visible. He closed the door and went inside. Emily arrived home later and kicked off her shoes, smiling at the ache in her feet. She poured a glass of water and checked her messages. One caught her eye. No sender name, just a sentence that felt like a benediction. She replied with a thank you and set the phone down. Evan ate a slice of pie and washed the plate. He sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched moths test the light. He thought of the invitation he had torn and the note he had kept. He did not weigh them against each other. He let them be what they were. Markers on a path he did not need to revisit to keep walking. Later, as the city settled into its uneven sleep, Evan lay down and felt the day loosen its grip. He thought of the hinge and the fence and the weight he had carried without ceremony. He thought of a building that had learned to pause. He did not feel finished. He felt aligned. In the morning, the lobby floor would gleam again. The door would open and close without complaint. A man would carry lumber. Another would hold a door. A question would be asked before an order. None of it would announce itself. That was the measure. The first snow of the season came early, and without warning, thin flakes drifting sideways and melting on contact with the pavement. Evan Carter noticed it while scraping frost from his windshield, the cold biting cleanly through his gloves. He paused, watching the flakes disappear as soon as they landed, and felt a familiar steadiness settle into his chest. Winter always clarified things. It stripped the city to essentials and asked who was prepared to stand still. Downtown Hallstone. Financial adjusted again. Coats appeared on chairbacks. Umbrellas leaned in corners. The lobby lights reflected off wet stone, the shine softer now, less theatrical. A cleaner moved methodically across the floor. his cart rolling with a quiet confidence that came from being seen. A senior manager waited until the cart passed, before crossing, offering a nod that was returned without ceremony. Richard Hall arrived, bundled against the cold breath visible as he stepped through the doors. He no longer scanned the room for affirmation. He scanned it for care. He noticed the cleaner's pace and the way people waited. He felt the weight of what he had nearly broken and the responsibility of what he was now holding together. Upstairs, his calendar was full, but his approach to it had changed. He would not fill silence with certainty today. Emily joined him at the elevator, scarf pulled tight. "Snow makes everyone honest," she said. "Or careful," Richard replied. "Sometimes they're the same," she said, and smiled. Frank Delaney watched the snow from the security office window and thought of other winters, other buildings, other kinds of watchfulness. He checked the feeds and saw nothing unusual. That was the point. He sent a brief update and shut the monitors down earlier than habit would have allowed. Outside, the city asked for attention. He intended to give it. Evan drove slowly, letting the weather dictate the pace. He passed a stalled car and pulled over without thinking, pushing until the engine caught and the driver's relief spilled into laughter. Evan waved it off and continued on the road, opening just enough to invite trust. At the hardware store, he picked up salt and a shovel he didn't need yet. Preparedness was a form of respect. By midday, the snow thickened and the city softened. Meetings shortened, voices lowered. Hallstone's board convened and adjourned with efficiency that did not mistake speed for clarity. A policy was amended, a training expanded. The fund released its first grants quietly, the way good work preferred to travel. Richard read the list and recognized names he had never bothered to learn before. He set the page down and resolved to change that. Evan returned home and cleared his steps, the scrape of shovel on concrete steady and meditative. A neighbor emerged and joined him without asking. They worked side by side, breath puffing white, the work ending when the path was clear enough. The neighbor thanked him. Evan nodded. It was enough. In the afternoon, Emily visited a community center where a grant had landed that morning. She listened to staff describe what the money would change. Not everything, just enough. She took notes and promised nothing she could not deliver. On her way out, she caught her reflection in a window and barely recognized the woman who had learned to wait. As evening approached, the snow slowed and the city exhaled. Lights blinked on in apartments and offices. Richard stood by the lobby windows and watched flakes settle at last, the ground beginning to hold them. He remembered the scrape of a wheel and how small a sound could become a fault line. He closed his eyes briefly and let the image pass without resistance. Evan sat at his kitchen table with a bowl of soup and a folded piece of paper he had not opened yet. He had found it in the drawer while looking for a screwdriver, the acknowledgement written in careful hand. He unfolded it and read it once more, not for reassurance but for alignment. He folded it again and returned it to the drawer, closing it softly. The phone rang as he washed the bowl. He answered. The voice on the other end was measured, respectful, familiar now. A question, not an offer. Evan listened, then spoke. "I'll think about it," he said. When the call ended, he looked out to the window at the snow and felt no urgency to decide. Winter allowed time. At Hallstone, the building emptied earlier than usual. People wished one another safe drives. A receptionist held the door for a cleaner and smiled. The cleaner smiled back, surprised and pleased. The moment passed and left a mark no one documented. Frank locked the security office and stepped into the cold, pulling his coat tight. He walked home instead of driving, letting the city remind him of its scale. He thought of lines drawn quietly, and of how easily they could fade if not tended. He resolved to tend them. Emily arrived home and set her boots by the door, snow melting into small, dark crescents on the mat. She made tea and stood by the window watching the street transform. She thought of the day's conversations and the work ahead. She felt tired in a way that made room for rest. Richard stayed late, finishing notes by hand. He wrote down the names of people he would speak to tomorrow, and then stopped realizing he would listen first. He turned off the lights and took the stairs, each step deliberate. Night fell fully, the city muted and reflective. Evan stepped onto the porch and breathed in the cold, the quiet sharpening his senses. He thought of winter's honesty and of the work that did not announce itself. He did not feel the need to be anywhere else. Snow gathered gently, finally staying where it landed. The paths cleared earlier began to fade, but their direction remained. Inside warm rooms and under steady lights, people moved with care they had learned to practice. Somewhere between preparation and patience, a measure held, and the city for once seemed willing to keep it. Spring arrived quietly, not as a declaration, but as permission. Evan Carter noticed it in the way the ice retreated from the curb and in the way the lake loosened its breath. He replaced the salt bucket with a rake, folded Winter into the shed, and stood a moment longer than necessary, letting the light settle where it wanted. The city shifted with the season shedding layers, without forgetting what they had protected. Downtown Hallstone Financial moved into its new rhythm, as if it had always been waiting for it. The lobby gleamed without spectacle. The floor reflected light that felt honest rather than polished for effect. People greeted one another without checking titles first. A cleaner laughed with an analyst near the elevators. The moment passed unremarkable and complete, and that was the measure. Richard Hall arrived one morning with no entourage and a notebook he carried himself. He paused at the threshold and watched the building wake. He no longer mistook motion for momentum. When he walked through the lobby, he did so with attention, noticing the work that made the space possible. Upstairs, meetings unfolded with fewer speeches and more listening. Decisions took longer and landed better. When he signed his name, it felt less like ownership and more like stewardship. Emily found herself working later again, not because she felt driven to prove anything, but because the work finally matched her patience. She built bridges where walls had been convenient and learned which compromises mattered. On her desk sat a small list written by hand. Names she intended to learn. Names she already had. She crossed none of them out. Frank Delaney kept watch without strain. The feeds stayed quiet. The incidents dwindled. When something did surface, it was met with calm rather than force. He trained new guards to notice posture and pace, to read rooms before reacting. He taught them that authority could be borrowed from care and returned intact. When he walked the building at night, the echo of his steps felt companionable. Evan lived into the ordinary he had chosen. He fixed things that needed fixing and left others alone. He took early walks and late drives and learned the names of neighbors without asking for their stories. When he helped, he did so briefly and moved on. He kept the drawer closed most days, the folded note resting where it belonged, not as a reminder, but as a reference he no longer needed to consult. One afternoon, he drove past the building downtown and did not stop. The glass caught the sun and threw it back bright and clean. He smiled once, small and private, and kept going. The road opened, and he followed it to the lake, where the water met the shore with a patience that felt earned. Inside Halston, a new hire stood in the lobby, unsure where to place a sign. A senior associate noticed and offered help. They adjusted it together, then stepped back to check the line. The associate nodded, satisfied, and moved on. The new hire exhaled and continued. No one recorded the moment. It would still be there tomorrow. Richard hosted a small gathering later that week. No speeches, no cameras. He thanked people by name and listened when they spoke. When the evening ended, he stood alone for a moment, the building humming around him, and understood that leadership was not a voice, but a practice that had to be renewed each day. Emily walked home through streets that smelled of rain and new leaves. She passed a fence straightened by quiet hands and thought of the way small choices bent futures. She reached her door lighter than she had been in months and slept without planning tomorrow. Frank drove home with the windows down, the city warm and alive. He thought of lines held and lines redrawn and felt a pride that did not need defending. He parked, shut off the engine, and listened to the neighborhood until the sounds stitched themselves into calm. Evan sat on his porch at dusk, a cup cooling in his hands, the sky easing into color. He thought of seasons and of work that left no plaque. He thought of a scrape on stone that had cracked something open, and of the care that followed step by step. He did not feel finished. He felt present. When darkness settled, the city carried on imperfect and capable. Doors opened and closed. Floors shone under steady light. People noticed one another a half-second sooner than they used to. The measure held not because it was enforced, but because it had been learned. If this story stayed with you, let it do what it does best by traveling quietly. Like it. Subscribe to the channel. And share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words. Quiet strength matters.